In just a few days, Pickup Limes is turning 5 years old already. Like, I can hardly believe it. And to celebrate, I thought, why not make our signature, most amazing chocolate cake recipe with you today? I feel like sometimes cakes can be pretty complicated to make, but this one is relatively simple, and I think the best part is that you don't need any eggs or milk or butter to make it. And now as we're making the cake, I thought I'd also just share with you sometimes the reasoning behind why we're choosing certain ingredients. And it's those ingredients and the chemistry behind them that yields a cake that's like really soft and moist and fluffy on the inside. And just as a heads up as well, I'm gonna be giving you the cup amounts of all of the ingredients we're gonna be using today. But if you do have a scale at home, it would be best to use that. Baking is really a science, and the more accurate you can get with the numbers, the more incredible the outcome of the cake is going to be. So we do have the gram and milliliter amounts for all of the ingredients on our website. I'm going to link that for you below. It's also where you can get a printable version of this recipe if you'd like. Now let's dive right in. We're gonna start first with lightly greasing 2 8-inch round cake pans, and then we're gonna cut out some round pieces of parchment paper that we're gonna use to line the inside of the greased pans with. Next, we're gonna make some vegan buttermilk. So to a medium bowl, we're gonna add a cup of unsweetened soy milk and a tablespoon of white vinegar, or you could use lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. Then we're gonna whisk this all together. Now, if you can't have soy milk, I'd recommend using some pea milk instead. And to explain why, let's dive into a little bit of a science baking experiment. Now, we've got 4 different kinds of plant-based milk here. We've got soy milk, pea milk, oat milk, and almond milk. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a little bit of vinegar to each of these, give it a stir, and wait 5 minutes and see what happens. Okay, so let's take a look at these different plant milks. You're gonna see that both the soy milk and the pea milk have curdled. They've gotten kind of clotted, and that's exactly what we want. It doesn't look appetizing, but that's what we want, and that's how you make vegan buttermilk. If we were to compare this to the oat milk and to the almond milk, we're gonna see that those ones haven't really curdled at all. And the reason for that is that these 2 plant milks are low in protein, and these 2 plant milks are high in protein. It's the protein that's curdling, and it's the protein that we want to be in this recipe. The reason being, protein adds to the softness and to the moistness of the cake, and it contributes to the flavor through the Maillard reaction, which you might remember we talked about in our cooking skills video. So the takeaway message here is that you want to try to use soy milk or pea milk for the optimal results in this cake recipe. Now, returning to the recipe, we're gonna grab a large bowl, and to it we're gonna sift in all of the dry ingredients. So this is gonna be 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 cup of Dutch processed cocoa powder, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, and then half of a teaspoon of salt. Then we're also gonna add in 1.5 cups of granulated sugar, and then we're gonna mix everything together the best we can. Once everything has been mixed together, we're gonna create a shallow well in the middle. Before we move on, let's talk about the difference between cacao powder and cocoa powder. So cacao powder, spelled with an A-O at the end, is made from raw fermented cocoa beans. And because it's not roasted, it's a little bit lighter in color, but it's also a little bit bitter in its taste. Now, cocoa powder, on the other hand, is the beans that have actually been roasted. And as a result, the powder is a little bit darker in color, which makes sense, but it's also still a bit bitter and usually quite acidic. Now, there's a certain type of cocoa powder that's been treated to remove the acidity, and that's called Dutch processed cocoa powder, or it could be known as alkalized cocoa powder, and that's what we're using for our recipe because it's more neutral tasting and more mellow in flavor. So I'd recommend, if you can, just check the label to make sure that you're buying the right kind of cocoa powder. Now, returning to the bowl with the clotted vegan buttermilk, we're now going to add in all of the rest of the wet ingredients, which is 3/4 of a cup of unsweetened applesauce. Applesauce makes the cake deliciously moist and adds its own natural sweetness too. Then we're gonna add in 1/2 of a cup of freshly brewed espresso, but if you don't have an espresso machine, some strong pour over coffee will do. Using coffee here helps to enhance the chocolate flavor in the cake and makes it just so much more decadent and rich. Then we're gonna be adding in 1/2 of a cup of melted refined coconut oil. So let's chat about the oil just for a quick second. I actually wouldn't recommend substituting for another kind of vegetable oil like canola or sunflower oil. We have tried it. It does work, but it leads to a cake that's just a little bit more crumbly on the inside. So if you want like the maximum best quality of cake, I'd actually recommend sticking with the coconut oil. Now, there's 2 different kinds of coconut oil. There's refined coconut oil, that's what we've used, and that just means that it's been processed to remove the taste and smell of coconut. But if you do want your chocolate cake to have like a coconutty taste, then you can use the unrefined coconut coconut oil if you'd like. We chose not to because I want the chocolate to be the most pronounced flavor in this cake. And now finally, we're gonna add in half of a tablespoon of pure vanilla extract, and then we're gonna mix this all together. Now what we can do is add the wet ingredients to the shallow well that's in the dry ingredients, and then we're gonna mix everything together until it's just combined, but be careful not to overmix. So you might remember from our cooking skills video that whenever you're making a baking recipe that includes flour, you really want to minimize how much you're stirring. And the reason is you don't want to develop the gluten strands. If you do, you're going to end up with a cake that's a bit more dense and rigid and less light and fluffy. So one tip is actually to stir in like a figure-of-8 motion. This is far superior to just regular back and forth stirring because it allows you to mix more efficiently with less aggravation of those gluten strands. Now, once everything is just combined, we're gonna divide the batter into our prepared cake pans. Gently tap the pans on the counter to remove any air bubbles, and then we can bake the cakes in a preheated oven at 350 Fahrenheit or 180 Celsius for about 33 to 35 minutes, but you're always gonna wanna check for yourself by inserting a thin wooden skewer into the center of the cake. If it comes out clean, then the cake is cooked through. Now make sure to let this cool for about 10 minutes in the pan before you transfer it to a wire rack to cool completely. Now, while we wait for the cakes to cool, we're gonna move on to making the most velvety and creamy chocolate buttercream frosting that you're probably ever gonna try. To a large bowl, we're gonna add a cup or 224 grams of a room temperature unsalted vegan butter, and we're gonna use an electric hand mixer to beat it until it's nice and light and fluffy. Then we're gonna add in 2 1/4 cup of powdered sugar and 3/4 of a cup of our cocoa powder. Then we're gonna mix this at a low speed until it's all combined. Then we can add in 1/3 cup of unsweetened plant-based milk, a teaspoon of vanilla extract, and then the best part, 1/3 cup of melted dairy-free dark chocolate. Then we're gonna mix it one more time until we're left with a smooth and fluffy frosting. And that's it, super easy. If you'd prefer though that it had a bit more of a thick consistency, although this is already quite thick, you can add a little bit more icing sugar. If you'd prefer that it had a thinner consistency, add a small splash of plant milk. And now I wanted to share a little hack before we frost our cake. We're gonna rip or cut a sheet of parchment paper into a few pieces, and then we're gonna place these pieces in a circular shape on our cake stand. Then you can grab one of your cakes and flip it on top of these parchment papers. And now we're ready to frost the cake, but just keep in mind that the frosting will actually melt if you apply it to a cake that's still warm. So make sure that this is cool before you begin. We're gonna begin with adding some frosting on top of the first cake, and then you can use a spatula or a butter knife to spread it out into a flat, even layer. Then we can flip the second cake upside down and place it on top of the first cake. Again, we're gonna frost the top first, and then we can frost all along the sides. Now this is optional. You can use your knife or your spatula to create a little pattern on top of the cake if you'd like. And now this is my favorite part. We can remove the parchment paper from underneath our cake so that we're left with a beautifully frosted cake with no mess around it on the cake stand. And now it's time to decorate the top of the cake. Of course, you could just serve it as it is, but if you'd like, you could add some sprinkles or some shaved chocolate or an assortment of fresh fruit like we're doing here.
I'm looking forward to this all day.
Oh my goodness, I love this. So there you go. This is a piece of cake to make, right? But listen, if chocolate cake's not your thing and you'd prefer vanilla cake, well, first of all, if you don't like chocolate, we can't be friends. But we do have a vanilla cake recipe on the blog, so I'm gonna link that for you below in case you'd prefer that. And again, the printable version of this recipe is on the blog, so check that out. Link is in the description. Anything else?
You gotta try it. It's my best.
It's my best.
My favorite, sorry.
All right, thanks so much for hanging. Really appreciate you guys also hanging with us for the last 5 years. You're the best. Pickup Lines signing off, and we'll see you in the next video. Oh, shoot. Oh no. We're gonna move on to making the most velvety and creamy chocolate buttercream frosting. Wow, this is like a tongue twister, this one. Here we go. We're gonna move on to making the most velvety and creamy chocolate buttercream frosting that you're ever. The most velvety and creamy chocolate buttercream. I keep saying buttercream. We're gonna move on to making the most velvety and creamy chocolate buttercream. Can I just say chocolate frosting?
Yes, could be.
Hey, happy birthday, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cannot not like it. It's great.